Today's speaker is Doug Wortman, who is a local attorney and significantly a 10-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force intelligence. Doug received his bachelor's in Russian, Central European, East European, and Eurasian studies from Kutztown. He has a master's degree in history from East Stroudsburg University and obtained his law degree from the Widener Commonwealth Law School in Harrisburg. Doug also studied overseas just after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Doug is a member of the Berks and Lehigh County Bar Associations and also serves on the Lehigh County Court of Common Pleas Board of Arbitrators. He is the founder and principal of Justitia Law, a multi-service law firm representing clients in divorce, child custody, child support, Chapter 7 bankruptcy, wills and estates, powers of attorney, driver's license suspension, ARD, and immigration issues. Doug was honored by the Pennsylvania Bar Association's pro bono program for his help with low-income clients and has also volunteered his legal services to veteran advocacy groups over the years. So Doug came to my attention when he authored an article that appeared in what's called the Berks Barrister, which is a publication of the Berks County Bar Association. The article was entitled, "A Look at Russia's Invasion Through the Eyes of a Former Air Force Intelligence Analyst." And the article really hit home for me because what it does is it attempts to put the Russian invasion of Ukraine into a historical perspective, which, from my vantage point, is glaringly absent from a lot of the commentary that we hear about this war. I think his comments are going to be extremely instructive today, and we are pleased that he agreed to join us for today's luncheon. So with no further ado, please welcome Doug Wortman.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dave, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you very much for having me. I am very pleased as well to see all the high school students here, and I'm hoping that you find it as informative as you hoped you would. So, to really understand the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have to put it into a historical context. If there were a Mount Rushmore in Russia, it would have, I believe, 4 leaders on it. But first, we're going to talk about these categories. I think you need to understand these different aspects of either Russian history or Russian culture or the conflict to really, truly understand what's happening and to possibly be able to understand how it will end. Again, if there was a Mount Rushmore of Russian leaders, I believe there would be 4 people on that. This is Tsar Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. The terrible is not a particularly good term to try to describe the Russian word Grozny. Grozny has no single English word. Grozny means awe-inspiring, certainly terrifying. It means all-powerful, and it means due of the utmost respect. That's what Grozny means. Terrible is I think, certainly a misnomer. Ivan ruled Russia from about 1582 until the early 1600s. He formed the first Russian secret police called the Oprichniki. There were black riders. They would ride throughout the villages of Russia, terrorizing the peasants, and they killed hundreds of thousands. This portrait or painting was painted by a very famous artist named Repin. This portrays Ivan just after he realizes that he has murdered his son in a fit of rage. The Tsarevich Ivan was his heir apparent, and he killed him in the Kremlin. This painting hangs in the Kremlin. It is as big as that wall right there, and it hangs in the Kremlin. They are very proud of the story. We move on. We see the one reason that Ivan is so widely revered in Russia is because after 200 years of Mongol occupation of Russia, he finally excavated the Tartars from Russia. And in that, he commissioned this, St. Basil's Cathedral, built in the mid-1500s. Rumor has it that Ivan had the architect's eyes gouged out after they built this building because he didn't want them to ever build anything its equal. I'm not sure if that's true, but I can tell you Russians hope it's true because they love that story. Move on about 100 years. Peter the Great, probably the best known Russian ruler, certainly the most famous in Russia and the most popular, ruled for about 50 years at the end of the 17th and early 18th century. Founder of the Russian Navy, he westernized Russia, and he made Russia a world power. This portrait portrays his son, Alexei, the Tsarevich, which means the heir apparent. Peter wanted Alexei to be prepared to take over as Tsar. He trained him militarily, he trained him in diplomatic and government functions. Alexei had no interest. Alexei was very pious. He preferred to read poetry under a tree, study the Bible, and spend time with his girlfriend. He asked his father to allow him to renounce the throne and to move to the country with his girlfriend. His father refused, told him he would marry who he told him to, and that he would do his duty. Alexei fled to Europe. Peter searched for him for about a year with his agents. He finally found him in Austria. Peter then submitted an ultimatum to Austria: return my son within 72 hours or I will go to war. He also sent a letter to Alexei promising, I will not harm you if you return home. This painting portrays that return and their first meeting. Peter was 6 feet 7 inches tall. His rage was terrifying. After this meeting, he slapped Alexei in irons, had him sent to prison, where he was tortured for about a month, including at the hand of his own father several times, and Alexei died in prison. We move forward about 200 years, and we get Uncle Joe Stalin, right? As Franklin Roosevelt used to call him. Stalin ruled with an iron fist. Approximately 30 million Russians died under his rule in those 20 to 30 years. Stalin's son during World War II, was a lieutenant in the artillery. He was captured by German forces. They then contacted the Russian government and offered a prisoner exchange. His name was Yakov. They would trade Yakov for a field marshal the Russians had in captivity. Stalin replied, "You do not trade field marshals for lieutenants." Yakov died 7 months later in a German concentration camp. Russian prisoners did not go to prisoner of war camps like Western prisoners, Europeans, Western European prisoners, French prisoners, American prisoners, British prisoners. They went to prisoner of war camps. Russian prisoners went to concentration camps. Virtually none of them survived the war. 3 points I'm trying to make here. No one has killed more Russians than their own leader, and the Russian people admire them for it for some reason. I don't know. I've never figured that out. Russians simply do not value human life the same way we think. And you do not rule Russia for decades unless you are ruthless, heartless, and murderous. It's as simple as that. For the past 22 years, Russia has graced us with this guy. Vladimir Putin was a 15-year KGB agent. Of course, he denies that there is an invasion. I'm sure we've all heard it. It's not invasion, right? It's special military operation. We'd be gone in no time. The Ukrainians never even noticed we here. Well, they noticed, okay? Right? Now, I know that's a joke, but he actually said that. The man said it on TV, and he said it over and over again. This is not an invasion. The reason he doesn't think this is an invasion is because Ukraine is part of Russia in his mind. You can't invade your own country. That's why he calls it a special military action. Now, I don't have any evidence that Vladimir Putin killed his own son, probably because he doesn't have one. He has daughters. But make no mistake, Vladimir Putin is a stone-cold killer. He was a wet agent in the KGB for 15 years. That means he was an assassin for the KGB. He was very successful at it because you don't rise to the top levels of the KGB by failing, or to the leadership of the Soviet Union, or Russia, excuse me. Vladimir Putin's goals are to, number one, get rid of every political rival he's ever had. And he's killed virtually every political rival he has ever had. And that, I mean virtually every single one. Whether they are in Russia or overseas, he finds them and he kills them. He's really good at it. His goals are for Russia to be powerful, respected, honored, and feared. And he is perfectly willing to put the Russian people through extreme hardship and deprivation to achieve those goals. He absolutely believes, 100% believes, that NATO left him no choice but to invade Ukraine. And I'll spend the next half hour explaining why. In an essay written last year entitled On the Historical Unity of Russia and Ukraine, Putin proclaimed that Russia is not a separate country and, quote, has never had a genuine history of statehood. To support this claim, Putin reached back to an earlier Vladimir, Saint Vladimir, Grand Prince of what the Russians consider their first empire, the Slavic Empire of Kiev and Rus, centered down here in Kiev, which is now modern-day Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. The center of power eventually came up here to Moscow, but at this time, Moscow was a little wooden village. This was at the end of the 10th century. Putin has reached back 1,000 years, and in a speech delivered just 2 days before the invasion, Putin claimed that Ukrainians and Belarusians and Russians are all Slavic descendants of ancient Kievan Rus. One people, a single whole, is how he put it. This philosophy goes back over 200 years, and it's called in Russia Slavophilism. It goes back farther. They just named it about 200 years ago. Slavophilism is a Russian imperial ideology that is a national tribalism extending to all Slavic peoples, including Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and the Balkans, who must all be gathered back into the Russian fold. It's based on the belief that Russia and its dominions, Ukraine and Belarus, are distinct economies and culture that belong to a single imperial whole. It is a defensive mechanism. If you integrate with the world, then you become more vulnerable. And that is happening to them right now. They are under sanctions that are becoming crippling to their economy. It would not have affected them as much 30 or 40 years ago when they were, in essence, a compartmentalized economy. Their worldview is, and always has been, we are Fortress Russia. We don't need anyone else. And in fact, this is the Kremlin. The Kremlin is a fortress. These are the walls of the Kremlin. These are the guard towers. Reaches all the way around. That's the Grand Kremlin Palace. Vlad works up here. These are cathedrals where all the czars are buried. Slavophilism has profound implications in Russian religion as well. Central to their faith is the Russian belief that Russian Orthodox Christianity, is superior to Western Christianity, which has been corrupted by Enlightenment ideas and Western decadence. In the Russian Orthodox tradition, the fourth Sunday of Lent is dedicated to St. John Climacus. St. John was a 7th century Russian Orthodox monk who wrote a treatise called The Ladder of Divine Ascent. It's meant to be a guidebook to a Christian life. In last April, at the Cathedral of the Armed Forces in Moscow, Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church, in essence their Pope, delivered a sermon in which he used St. John as the basis for that sermon. He told the audience that the greatest and holiest gift that God has given to man is the feeling of love. I think we can all agree on that in some form or fashion, right? But then about halfway through, the sermon took a disturbing turn. Excuse me. He said he'd come to address the leaders of the Russian military and through them their troops. He reminded the congregation of Putin's favorite propaganda point in this war, that Russia is fighting fascism and Nazism in Ukraine, just as it had in World War II. Then Patriarch Kirill presented a version of history that denied Ukraine's very existence. He blamed outside forces in the Middle Ages for what he regards as a false division between Russia and Ukraine. In fact, he doesn't even acknowledge there are such people as Ukrainians, referring to all involved parties, including Belarusians, as, quote, holy Russians. Patriarch Kirill's sermon did no less than deny Ukraine's right to exist as a nation and legitimize the ongoing violence as a, quote, necessary and holy battle against the Western Antichrist. Let's consider that for a moment. You're a Russian conscripted soldier, you're 20 years old, and you've just been told that not only are you fighting Nazis in Ukraine, you're fighting satanic Nazis in Ukraine, right? And by extension, you're being told that no brutality you inflict on that enemy, no atrocity is too cruel, and it is sanctioned not only by your government and by your military, but by God. Russian cruelty to Ukraine is not unprecedented. We get back to Secretary General Joseph Stalin, and ruled Russia, Soviet Union from 1928 until 1953, until he died. That's a pattern. Russians don't leave power. They die. And I wouldn't want to be one of Putin's clones when he does die. I can tell you that. Back in the 1930s, there was a famine in Ukraine. To force peasants to join collective farms, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin orchestrated a famine that starved millions of Ukrainians. Crops were seized and sold overseas markets into Moscow. All animals, all livestock, including pets, were removed. Soviet soldiers were kept in Ukraine to make sure that that continued. 4 million Ukrainians died in this genocide. After the famine, Stalin imported thousands of Russians with no ability to speak Ukrainian, no ties to the country, into eastern Ukraine to repopulate it. This created lasting fault lines. The eastern population of Ukraine tends to be more Russian-speaking and Orthodox, while the west is more Ukrainian-speaking and Catholic. This pull, both east and west, has long defined Ukraine. You can see where that divide is. These are the 4 republics that the Russians just held a referendum on. This is the Crimean Peninsula. This is western Ukraine. Fast forward to 1941, June 22nd, through Poland. Sorry. I knew I would do that at least once. My apologies. (1941) German army invades the Soviet Union through Poland and through Ukraine. Ukrainian people greet them as liberators in Western Ukraine. You freed us from Stalin. Of course, after the German Wehrmacht comes, following them is Reichsführer Heimlich Himmler and the Gestapo, and then things go downhill very quickly. This is a Ukrainian SS unit. Now, it's a Waffen-SS division, which means they were combat infantry, not camp. They weren't running the camps. But you don't get to be in the Waffen-SS unless you are a fanatical Nazi willing to give your last dying breath for the Führer. We've seen how tough the Ukrainian military is. These boys were tough. They killed a lot of a lot of Russians. And guess who didn't forget that? Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Putin. Hence, Vladimir Putin's claim, we are fighting Nazis and fascists in Ukraine. These were crack troops, as I said, except this fella right here, he needs a little bit of discipline on his eyes front. He's probably after Reichsführer Himmler saw that, he probably ended up in a mine-clearing division. I took this picture. This is the Moscow River. This is the Kremlin. This, in the distance, is MGU, Moscow University. Next to that, it sits on the Sparrow Hills, and you can see one of the hills right there. That's where the advance of German troops was finally stopped in World War II. There is a white line across the boulevard that they repaint every week that marks that spot. They have not forgotten. It is the most traumatic event in their nation's history, and they still have not completely recovered from it. They lost 30 million people in World War II. To put that in perspective, the United States lost about 600,000. Two-thirds of those 30 million people were civilians. I had a rush. My understanding is there's some veterans in the audience, and I hope you'll appreciate this. When I studied in Moscow at the Diplomatic Academy, they had a foreign service person from the Russian Foreign Service come in and speak to us, and he pointed out over and over again in his speech that he thought, it wasn't a speech, it was an informal presentation, but that he felt that the United States would never be able to sustain the casualties that they had in World War II without giving up, and that we should never fight Russia because we would not be able to sustain those casualties. And he pointed out that we only lost 500 troops where they lost 10 million. I raised my hand and asked him if he ever considered the fact that maybe we're just better at it than you are. He didn't think it was as funny as I did. Since that time, and even since the Napoleonic era, Russians have been very concerned about their national security. Naturally, they've been invaded repeatedly. I will let Thomas E. Graham describe to you what strategic depth is, and I'll give you a moment to read that, because he does it very well. You just push until you meet something that can resist you. This is a map of post-World War II Europe. We've got Soviet Union here, and of course, Eastern Europe. All these countries were liberated by the Soviet army from Germany. Germany was divided in half. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria all became Soviet satellite states. Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, all neutral. Sweden and Finland, neutral, although since the Russians have gotten happy feet and started goose-stepping into their neighbors, they seem to be reconsidering their neutrality and want to join NATO now. They had their buffer zone at the end of World War II. They swore that if another world war is fought, it's not going to be fought here, it's going to be fought here and eventually here. I see France is included in the NATO. They jump in and out as they want. I'm not sure if they're in NATO anymore or not. In the end, it really doesn't matter, though, quite frankly. This is modern-day Europe. Countries in blue are NATO. The Warsaw Pact no longer exists. And all these countries that were once Soviet satellites in the Warsaw Pact are now NATO nations. Germany has been reunited. Poland joined first, and they kind of just went down the line here. Right now, as we speak, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, has deployed to Romania, and what the commander called a combat deployment. The first combat deployment of the Screaming Eagles since World War II. My father was in the Army for 40 years. He spoke constantly of two different divisions that he admired the most, the 101st Airborne Division and the 10th Mountain Division. When we send those, boys, it's a message. And that commander said that he was ready at any time to go into combat. Next, Next, to join NATO were former Soviet republics, the Baltic republics right here, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Every time one of these countries joined NATO, Putin gives a speech in which he calls it the West's anti-Russia project. If you look, this buffer zone is gone. And the only allies they have left are Belarus and Armenia. Yikes. Not only that, but the Soviet republics that were once the buffer zone, 3 of them are gone. Vladimir Putin will watch the world burn before he will allow Ukraine to join NATO. It's as simple as that. If you look at how Ukraine juts into Russia, right here, Moscow is about right here. That's about 600 miles. There is no possible way Vladimir Putin will allow NATO troops to be stationed 600 miles from Moscow. There's another reason he won't allow this. This is the Black Sea. We go back to Peter the Great. This is Kerch. There's a strait right here that you can sail through that was controlled by Turkey. Peter the Great fought a 20-year war to take that spot right there. Because Turkey would put guns here and here, Peter was trying to build a navy. This is the Don River. Supplies would flow down from the Don River into the Sea of Azov, where they had shipbuilding facilities. They wanted to be able to sail through here, get to the Black Sea Fleet, go through the Bosphorus Straits, through the Dardanelles Straits into the Mediterranean, and then off into the open seas to cause trouble and to trade. Took him 20 years to take it, but he took it. Then the Black Sea became a Russian lake. They were then, as I say, they were be able to come to agreements with Turkey through a peace treaty to have access through these areas, and then they were able to start sailing their navy. This is Sevastopol. It's a Russian naval base, probably the most important one they have. It is a warm water port in the Black Sea. Russia is cold, especially in the north. Their ports freeze, and they can't sail their navy about 6 months out of the year from those northern ports. This is their only warm water port. If you can't sail your navy, you're not a world power. Simple as that. These are nuclear submarines. This is a boomer. It means it carries nuclear missiles. You can tell because it's wider. This is an attack submarine. This is probably the most important part of a nuclear triad. A nuclear triad means there are land-based missiles, there are air-based missiles, and there are sea-based missiles. You can blow the land-based missiles with an initial strike, and they can't move them. You can bomb air bases and shoot airplanes out of the sky. These guys are hard to find. Every one of them has enough missiles on it with what are called multiple reentry vehicle, which means each missile has several warheads on it that will split and hit different targets. There's probably about 12, would be my guess, nuclear missiles on board that. They could destroy the entire East Coast. This is deterrence. This is mutually assured destruction, MAD. Okay? Even if you take out all my land missiles, even if you take out all my airplanes, you're not going to find our subs. And they're going to be right next to you in the water, and you're never going to see us, and we're going to launch. So even if you win the initial attack, you're still going to lose. Mutually assured destruction. If he cannot sail these, he is extremely vulnerable to nuclear attack. Again, Vladimir Putin will watch the world burn before he will give up Sevastopol Naval Base. That's why in 2014, he annexed the Crimea. Even if Ukraine does join NATO some way, somehow, you're not getting this. This is the Donbass where much of the fighting is taking place right now. He took that area also in 2014. The Russian Federal Security Service, the successor to the KGB. Putin has two domestic power bases, the intelligence agencies and the military. Putin was, as I said, a former KGB officer, and he's maintained a very close relationship with his intelligence agencies. Many of its current members and leadership and former members are his closest confidants. The second power brokers within the country are the military, led by Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov. These two men have earned Putin's trust through decades of loyal and unwavering service. The war is not going well for the Russians, and both these agencies have failed Putin drastically. Intelligence took the first hit. They predicted to Putin that Russian troops would march down Ukraine Main Street within 48 hours. They brought parade uniforms for just that purpose. He was told by his intelligence operatives that the Ukrainian people would greet Russian troops as liberators, that the Ukrainian troops would not fight, that they would cave quickly, and that NATO would not get overtly involved. Wrong on all three. The military has not escaped failure and scrutiny. They're getting beat badly, a result of decades of deferred maintenance and blatant corruption. Excessive dependence on conscripts, extremely low morale, poor training, equipment vulnerabilities, and weaknesses and equipment failures. Probably most importantly, virtually no professional non-commissioned officer corps within their military. And all that has shown a very unflattering spotlight on what was considered the world's second strongest military. So, both sides need time to redeem themselves. The intelligence community needs time to redeem themselves through covert operations in the occupied territories, and the military needs time to redeem themselves to somehow find a way to become victorious. So neither party is likely to advise Putin to end hostilities anytime soon, because they certainly want to delay the inevitable day of reckoning when they have to be accounted. So even if things continue to go badly, neither side is going to, I think, advise Putin to end the hostilities anytime soon. Why are the Russians losing? They have never figured out in the 21st century combined arms operations, combining armored vehicles, artillery and infantry, and airport into synchronized and complementary attacks. It is crucial to the success of 21st century warfare. The Ukrainians have figured it out. NATO has figured it out. The Russians have not. The war's in its ninth month. The Russian military suffers from an acute shortage of personnel, lack of coordination between units, and unstable supply lines. They are failing at combined arms operation, and they are getting their teeth kicked in this war. Ukrainians are advancing, although things seem to have slowed down a little bit. These are the areas that Russia controlled at the beginning of the war, and you can see that these areas here are the areas that the Ukrainians have taken back in their latest advances. Putin, I'm sure you may know, had a referendum in these 4 areas. It was a joke. They came to people's doors with guns, said, vote, and vote for this guy, right? And so all these 4 areas have been voted by referendum to be now part of Russia. Putin has threatened that if you attack Russia, I will use whatever weapons I have at my disposal to repel that attack. So here's the question. When Ukrainian troops are going into here, how does Putin react? Right now, his troops are in massive retreat, and they're leaving all their equipment behind, to the point where the Ukrainian commander of the military said the other day that the number one supplier of arms to the Ukrainian military are the Russians. What happens? How does this end? I do not know. I was talking to Dave Bean about that. I think what happens is at some point the Russians are going to want to come to legitimate peace talks. I put in my article several months ago that if the Ukrainians stop the Russians, and I'm going to go back to that slide, if the Ukrainians stop the Russians in this area, Putin will be faced with a stark choice. Commit more combat troops and equipment to a fight that could drag on for years, or negotiate in earnest for peace talks. He gave us his answer. He conscripted 300,000 soldiers. Now, the Russians don't have a reserve like we do. Okay, we have the active duty, we have a reserve, and then we also have what's called the active ready reserve. In other words, when you join the military now, whatever it may be, 3 or 4 years, you are also committing to a follow-on 3 or 4 years where they can call you back at any time until you have to serve. It's called the ready reserve. That's what the Russians have for a reserve, but there's no 3 or 4 year time limit on that. They're calling guys that are 60 years old that were cooks and saying, come fight. And they're dying like flies. They're making the situation worse because they're not trained, and their comrades cannot count on them and depend on them. Their morale is in the tank. And I don't certainly know how Putin is going to react when he starts losing. That's to be determined. I just thought I'd include some pictures here of when I was in Moscow and thought you might enjoy them. Again, that's St. Basil's Cathedral. This is the Winter Palace, built by Catherine the Great. It's in St. Petersburg. This is the site of the Russian Revolution, where it actually occurred. This is one of the most remarkable art museums in the world. It is an amazing, amazing place. St. Petersburg is a beautiful city. It's about the only beautiful city in Russia, though, trust me. St. Petersburg was modeled on Venice. It's a city of canals. This is taken off the Nevsky Plaza, the most famous street in St. Petersburg. This was taken at midnight, by the way. It doesn't get dark there in the summer. This is Red Square in the Kremlin. I thought some people, I always get asked, can you show us something secret? You worked in intelligence. Here you go. Okay? But I promise you I declassified it the proper way, so if there's any federal agents out there, you can see. Okay? I just like to describe this to you. This is, I was in an F-15 squadron. This is out of Langley Air Force Base. That's the most, at the time anyway, the best fighter jet in the world, in my opinion. This is a Russian Bear bomber. It's a prop plane, as you can see. They don't really use them as bombers anymore. They use them as reconnaissance aircraft and surveillance aircraft, and you can see they've added a little surveillance nub there on the bottom. He was tracking Soviet or American submarines out of Charleston, South Carolina, and in Norfolk. And I took this picture. We approached them. I wasn't flying. I'm not a pilot. I was in the back seat, but I took the picture, and we were telling them to get out of U.S. airspace. They were pretending they couldn't hear us. You had a little Russian back in this window. He was shooting us the moon the whole time we were there. It was kind of funny. Here's another one. We did this quite often. They would try to venture out. They would try to test us, find out how quickly we would intercept them and what we would do. And so we did this quite often. I'd like to go back to that picture. This was my squadron commander flying. He was no one to mess with. These are fuel tanks. They're detachable. They're not bombs. But right there, that's a missile, heat seeker, Team 9 Sidewinder. When this guy refused to leave, Colonel Moore tipped it like that to make sure he could see that missile, and then tipped her down. He took off. This is the Lenin Museum. These are Russian soldiers. They're their honor guard, in essence, kind of like their tomb of the last of the unknown soldier. I have a letter. I just want to give you kind of an indication of, and then I'll finish, but I want to give you an indication of the morale of the Russian military right now, because it's truly terrible. I didn't know whether I should read this or not, but in the end I decided to. It's written on August 17th, 2022, to my wife. This is a letter for the future, if I should die or be taken prisoner or become a vegetable. It is very hard to write. I'm crying, but I must. Beloved Lara, tell our son what kind of a dad I was, that we were sent as cannon fodder to Zaliman, without armor, without ammunition, without normal weapons. This is about our situation. When our son grows up, tell him his dad wanted very much to return home, to be the best dad ever. I'm drinking and I'm writing emotionally. I know that all this will be forgotten, and that you will be living your own life. That you'll find a new husband, and that I'll simply disappear in the war like all the guys. Unfortunately, I didn't have a normal life. Say that Dad was an athlete, didn't smoke and didn't drink. It's terrible that everyone has forgotten me. It's very hard to accept this, but all people die, and this cycle can't be changed. It's bad to die in the summer. If only I were at the seashore. This letter was written by V.V. Tereshchenko, a 24-year-old conscripted soldier in the Russian army, was found on his body by Ukrainian intelligence officers. Are the Russian soldiers, Russian military, committing atrocities and war crimes in Ukraine? You bet they are. And it's awful. And I don't see any end to it very soon. But I think, as this letter demonstrates, all war is a crime. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Doug. Before we get into the Q&A part of the program, I just wanted to spend a couple minutes describing our next two upcoming programs. They will both be here at Legends. The presentation that we have in December is scheduled on the 14th. The title of the program is Latin America Leans Left, Associated Trends Supporting the Shift. And that presentation will be from Dr. Kerwin Schaefer, who is a professor of Latin American Studies at Penn State Berks. And then fast forward to 2023, our January program is scheduled on the 18th, and both of these programs are here at Legends at noon. Our January program is entitled The Significance of German-American Relations, A Personal Experience. And our presenters are James Garrett, a recent Penn State main campus graduate. He presented to us virtually last spring, and he will be joined during the presentation by Tabia Kuhlmann, who is currently attending the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. They both participated in what's called an Ambassadors in Sneakers program last summer, where they spent time in Germany and here in the United States exchanging cultural ideas. So really looking forward to that presentation. So with that, I'm going to, where's Mike Sutton? So Mike is going to facilitate our Q&A. Mike, I'll turn things over to you at this point.
Thank you, David. And Mr. Wortman, I appreciate you calling out the eyes forward discipline of the Russian military as a former Marine. I appreciate that. Thank you, sir. All right, we are going to try something a little bit different, or at least add a new option for the Q&A. If anybody would like to ask their own question, raise your hand, and I will come to you and give you the opportunity to do that. Two rules are: this is my microphone. Don't touch it. I'll hold it. Resist the urge to take it from me. And no follow-up questions unless you're asked for clarification. Otherwise, have at it. I'll probably take just a couple questions because we're approaching 1 o'clock. We'll start with this. So would you consider George W. Bush's assessment of Putin to be terribly naive? The U.S. assessment, both officially and personally, improved since then?
So I'm not certain what George Bush's assessment was. You'd have to remind me of what that was.
Do you want to clarify, Mike?
I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul.
Oh, if he saw anything but a murderous soul, then I don't know what he was seeing, because, as I said, he's a stone-cold killer and proud of it.
Here we go. Try this for the very first time. Here's your first question from the audience.
Oh, you hold it. I don't think it's unreasonable for Russia to want a warm water port. So my question is, if negotiations do come, is there any conceivable way in which the Ukrainians will allow the Russians to maybe have a lease on Sevastopol? Otherwise, they could just keep fighting forever.
That's a great question. And I was speaking with Dave about that earlier. I think that the Ukrainians are going to be highly resistant to that, but I believe that NATO is going to force the Ukrainians to accept that, and that's going to be part of any peace negotiation, is that the Russians will keep the Crimea. And I think that's maybe our best chance here, is that they keep some of these areas, maybe of the separatist areas that they have that are really populated by Russian people anyway, and are causing real problems. Those separatists are fighting with the Ukrainians, and there's almost a civil war going on, and that's another reason for the invasion. So I think that if the Ukrainians could just accept that, listen, they need a little breathing space here, and we're going to allow them to keep Sevastopol. I think if they don't agree to that, NATO will tell them, either you agree or we're going to shut off the spigot. And I think that would be what will force the Ukrainians to do that. So I think that's probably the most likely scenario. I agree.
Another question from this side of the room.
How close are Sweden and Finland to being NATO members, and what impact will that have on the situation?
Well, I think they are going to be admitted. I don't think that there's too much. I think the Turks were the only one that had any objection to it, and I think they've lifted those objections based on some assurances that they received from the Swedes. So I'm pretty certain that's going to happen. How does that affect things? Well, Putin said at one point he was really worried about Finland. The Finns and Russians fought. The Finns took the German side in World War II, and they had, I believe they even had SS troops as well. So there's a lot of resentment between Finland and Russia and some mistrust. So I think that's just going to make him feel more squeezed, quite frankly, and I don't know what that really does for NATO or for our defense, but it certainly helps Finland's defense, yeah.
We are hiding over here behind the structure. Here's a question from Dr. Randy Noonan.
Well, I thought this would be something you'd have some insight in as a former Air Force intel person. What is your assessment of the air situation in the war?
You know, I've been very flabbergasted by that because I thought for certain the Soviets or the Russians would have complete air superiority, and they haven't. And I haven't figured out why. I don't know if their pilots are bad, or their planes are bad, or they're not flying, or they're afraid to fly because they're getting shot down. I do know that NATO just sent, and the United States just sent our 2 best surface-to-air missile packages there, a lot of them. So they're going to control the skies even more, the Ukrainians are. And I don't know, I wish I knew the answer to your question. I don't know why the Russians either haven't facilitated their air power or it's not working. But I know they're getting shot down a lot. I know they're losing a lot of planes. Maybe they're running out of pilots. I don't know. But I'm curious about the same thing. Yeah.
You described Putin as a stone-cold killer, and this could be the West wanting. Do you see any sort of overthrow? And if there was, would another stone-cold killer replace him?
Well, that's the worry. But he's killed virtually every political rival he has, and I mean he's been very effective at it. They're all gone. I don't know who would replace him, quite frankly, and I don't know who would have the power to overthrow him. And then I agree, we could end up there with some Russian Duma member who's even crazier than he is. And so I don't think he's going anywhere. I truly don't. I think he's consolidated his power too well, and I think he's there till he dies. Now I've seen reports that his health isn't good, but I know the CIA director said at one point he's all too healthy, so I don't know how valid those reports are.
Question submitted on paper. Can you elaborate on the Wagner Group?
I'm sorry, what?
The Wagner Group?
Oh, the Wagner Group. That's one of Putin's strongest supporters is the head of this Wagner Group. They're mercenaries. I don't know if they come from a lot of different countries. I truly don't know a lot about them. But it's very telling that they are depending on them more than they are on their own military at this point, which they seem to be. How effective they're being, I do not know. How many Game of Thrones fans do we have? They're sellswords is what they are. Okay, they're simply mercenaries. And so how effectively they interact with other Russian military units, I don't think they're probably trusted a whole lot by the other Russian military units. I did see that a lot of Wagner Group officers are now commanding Russian units, and I can tell you those troops that have some mercenary come and take over and replace their CO as a Marine, how would you feel about that? Am I going to trust this guy? Am I going to go and fight for him? If he's fighting for money and not for country or whatever it may be, I'm not comfortable with that personally, and I don't think that anybody else would be too. So I don't know how much impact they have, but they are out there, and they are the worst of the worst as far as atrocities. They are terrible.
Another question here.
Excuse me. From the viewpoint of beginning of this year, how does the situation with Ukraine differ from the United States-Cuba missile crisis?
Well, I mean, that's a valid question, and I was speaking about that before. If you go back to that slide and you show where Ukraine juts into Russia and they're only 600 miles, in a million years would the United States accept that? We didn't even accept missiles in Cuba, okay? There's no way, and we call it, manifest destiny, right? We call it the Monroe Doctrine, right? You don't mess in this side of the area of the world. Why can't they have their own Monroe Doctrine? I don't know why they can't, but I agree with you. I think the United States and NATO has to recognize legitimate security concerns based on their history and their paranoia of constant, invasion throughout a 1,000-year history. Yeah.
Question from one of our Muhlenberg students back here, stage left.
So despite Russia's beliefs that the Balkans, Poland, Ukraine is still part of Russia, the rest of the world, like on globes and on maps, Ukraine is identified as its own country. How do you think that, or what do you believe, how has the rest of the world's view that, and Ukraine's view that it's itself an independent country, how it fights?
It's a great question. They do not consider themselves Russian. Ukraine is a separate language, although it's very similar. It's a separate language, a separate culture completely. The Russians don't see it that way. They can kind of look at Ukraine like you're a state, right? Like you're Alabama or something, right? But they're not. They're a sovereign nation, as you said, and they have been for a long time. That's the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Does the rest of the world believe that Ukraine is part of Russia? No, absolutely not. They are members of the United Nations. They are a sovereign nation. They have ambassadors with all the countries. They have been recognized, and it was immediate. We couldn't wait to recognize them once the Soviet Union fell and dance on their grave. Sure, yeah.
Another student question here from Wilson High School.
Is Vladimir Putin taking advantage of NATO and the United States' stance on the war in Ukraine? Is the current political state in America factoring into place in his decisions?
You mean to secure his position as leader?
Yeah, and back up what is he doing in Ukraine? Like, is he taking advantage of the views of the United States and the current political state we're in?
Oh, and do you mean, is he taking advantage of the current political situation in the United States, yes, and kind of the division between red and blue? Yes. Absolutely. And I think you mentioned the Wagner Group the other day. He's one of Putin's most trusted advisors, and he admitted openly, we are tampering with elections in the United States. We're going to continue to tamper with elections in the United States. Now, in their defense, if anybody thinks the CIA doesn't tamper in foreign elections, you're very naive, okay? We do it all the time. We get to be a little bit hypocritical sometimes. I'm sorry, but we do, okay? But if you think the CIA doesn't do the same thing, then, you know, I have some beachfront property to sell you in the Poconos. I mean, we do it too, okay?
From Kutztown University over here on your right.
You mentioned how Putin currently doesn't have any political rivals left alive. If you were to die, would how would the resulting power struggle affect the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. First of all, would they have an election? They would. How valid are their elections? I truly don't know anymore. Putin kind of changed everything. Okay, they had an original constitution that said you could serve 2 terms. Then he switched it to you can serve 2 terms, and then you can sit a term out, and then you can serve another 2 terms, and add infinitum with that. You can continue to do that. Then he changed it to, he got rid of the whole consecutive terms thing, and now I can just serve until I die, is what he's got it at now. How that affects future elections and future leaders, I do not know. That remains to be seen. But, I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
How would the power struggle affect the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, that's another great question, and we talked about that. Is it going to be someone who is rational and reasonable and says, listen, we're losing and we need to cut our losses and figure out how to start repairing our army, which is going to take them decades to do? Or are they going to say, we're going to double down? I don't know. It just depends. Right now, Putin's doubled down. What his successors do, if he has successors during this war, I do not know. I don't anticipate him dying before the war ends, though I truly don't. I mean, he looks pretty healthy to me.
I don't see any other questions, so I'll ask the last one. I'll get David Bean back up on stage. I think everybody was surprised by the effectiveness of the Ukrainian defense initially. They're continuing to deliver very damaging hits to the Russians.
Yes.
What's enough for them?
What is victory for them? Well, first of all, that's a great point. The reason they're winning, they've been preparing for this since 2014, and NATO's been helping them very quietly. They prepared for Russian tanks, an overwhelming amount of Russian tanks. How did they counter those? The javelins, right? Very effective. Russians weren't prepared for those. Okay, how have they neutralized Russian air power? Stinger missiles, which are a lot better than they were when I was in the Air Force, because they're shooting down planes left and right, okay? Now, we send them those HIMARS, right? These artillery that they're detecting and locating Russian artillery positions and blowing them to bits. So they're winning because they've been preparing for for a long time, since 2014, with NATO help and NATO funding. And NATO planning, NATO intelligence, everything they're getting. So, I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question? Again,
I think that was pretty much it. Just at what point does Ukraine stop having to be quite so...
what does Ukraine consider victory here? That's what we have yet to determine. They're saying not until we get every inch of Ukrainian territory back. That is possibly unrealistic. And again, I think NATO is going to temper that. What NATO finally decides, I believe we're going to go back to the Crimean Peninsula, them keeping that, and some portion of those separatist territories I think will end up happening. The Ukrainian attitude is that's not going to satisfy them. That only encourages them. Now all they're going to do is invade more because they think next time they're going to get a bigger chunk because there's going to be another peace agreement. Okay? And we're going to have to get something else next time. That's the Ukrainian view on that. What they're going to do, I do not know.
Excellent presentation. Thank you for your time today, Mr. Wortman. And we'll turn things back over to David Bean, WAC President.
Yeah, Doug, before you go, we do have a gift for you. So Nolde Pottery creates specialized plates for the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, and would like to present that with you right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And we also thank Doug. Next Friday, he is going to be presenting to students at Antietam and Twin Valley. Dr. Lausch is going to take him to both of those schools for presentation. So we thank him in advance for doing that for us as well.